Shalom. I'm Eddie Chumney of Hebraic Heritage Ministries, and we welcome you to this week's Focus Israel Report. In this week's report, we're going to be sharing with you regarding the current status of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, and it is as follows. According to Debka, which is an Israeli intelligence and news-gathering website, Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has informed U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry of his acceptance in principle of the U.S. Framework Agreement, subject to the reservations he has raised with U.S. Special Envoy Martin Indyk. A high-ranking U.S. official said, "We all know that the die is cast in Israel and that Netanyahu has accepted Kerry's guidelines. Now they are working on the reservations he needs to submit for his government coalition to survive the expected storm of protest and resistance and for the talks with the Palestinians to carry on. Netanyahu will also try presenting the Kerry paper to the public as an American proposal, which is not binding either on Israel or the Palestinians except for the attached reservations. U.S. officials predict that those reservations will eventually find their way to the garbage disposal. In 2004, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon appended 16 reservations to then U.S. President George W. Bush's letter defining the American position on the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. Sharon's reservations had dropped by the wayside by the time the U.S. Congress came to approve the Bush letter in its original form. Informed sources in the United States forecast a similar fate for the Kerry Framework document. The Prime Minister's office and Israel's embassy have asked the United States State Department to delay publication of the Kerry Framework proposal to mid-April during the Israeli Knesset's Passover recess. This will help Netanyahu to stay clear of the rowdy debates and heated special sessions he expects to erupt over his acceptance of the U.S. framework. As a result, Kerry may therefore add a few weeks to the 3-week negotiating timetable and release his framework accord at the end of April or in early May. According to various sources, Kerry's framework proposal will call for recognizing Israel as a Jewish state. The Palestinians are expected to reject this element of the framework. The U.S. may present a copy of Kerry's framework to Netanyahu when Netanyahu visits the United States the first week of March. Kerry's framework will call Israel the nation-state of the Jewish people and Palestine the nation-state of the Palestinian people. When you talk about a Jewish state, you are talking about the end of any solution for Palestinian refugees. Do you think any Palestinian can accept this? Nabil Sha'ath, a senior Palestinian official, said. If Mr. Kerry thinks this is the sum of his brilliant intelligence, his framework agreement will go nowhere. It's impossible for the Palestinians to sign such an agreement with Israel. In addition, Kerry's framework will propose a peace agreement based upon 1967 borders with land swaps that takes into account demographic changes on the ground. This is a phrase meant to enable Israel to keep settlement blocks in the West Bank in East Jerusalem. The Palestinians want East Jerusalem, which is a sector that includes many biblical holy sites, as their capital. Netanyahu is insisting that a Palestinian capital be sited in an unspecified area termed Greater Jerusalem, possibly meaning the city's outer-lying suburbs. He also wants reference to the Palestinian demands to be referred to as merely an aspiration. Palestinian official Nabil Abu Radena warned that the framework document should not cross Palestinian red lines, which is a Palestinian state based upon 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital, and calling Israeli settlements illegal instead of illegitimate. Kerry is suggesting that the Palestinian and Israeli leaders be permitted to express reservations regarding the U.S. plan. However, the U.S. framework proposal will be the basis for the continuation of peace talks. Kerry said that he believed that these conditions provide the only way for Israel and the Palestinians to politically be able to keep the negotiations going forward, for them as leaders to be able to embrace an endgame. They need to have the right to be able to have some objection, he said. In response, Abu Radena said that the use of the word reservations bogs down the peace process, and the use of this concept in the past has gotten the peace process stuck. As a result, he said, it is doomed to to fail. So the Palestinians have informed U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry that it will not accept his framework peace proposal as it currently stands. According to Palestinian officials, the central clauses in Kerry's framework proposal, which is being rejected by the Palestinians, is as follows. Number 1, borders. The peace agreement is to be based on pre-1967 lines, but will take into consideration changes on the ground in the decades since. Number 2, settlements. There will be no massive evacuation of residents. Number 3, refugees. Palestinian refugees will be able to return to Palestine or remain where they currently live. In addition, it is possible that a limited number of refugees could be allowed into pre-1967 Israel as a humanitarian gesture and only with Israel acquiescence. Nowhere is it written that Israel bears responsibility for suffering caused to the refugees. Number 4, the capital. The Palestinian capital will be in Jerusalem. Number 5, security. Israel has a right to defend itself by itself. Number 6, the Jordan Valley. The Israeli army will retain a presence in the Jordan Valley. The length of time the Israeli army will remain will depend on the abilities of the Palestinian security forces. Number 7, border crossings. Israel will continue to control border crossings into Jordan. Number 8, definition of the countries. 2 states will result in a national state of the Jewish people and a national state of the Palestinian people. Senior Palestinian officials say that these clauses are unacceptable to the Palestinians for several reasons. For a start, the reference to the borders and settlements leave too much room for Israeli interpretation. What does "there will be no widespread evacuation of residents" mean? Asked one official. This means that Israel will want to keep a bigger percentage of the West Bank, and this point is not acceptable to us. What does "taking into consideration changes on the ground since then" mean? I mean, Israel continues to build settlements. The official added that a still more problematic issue for the Palestinians is Jerusalem. When the Palestinian capital is defined as in Jerusalem, what does that mean? We demanded that the Palestinian capital be in East Jerusalem, but Netanyahu refused firmly, and the U.S. administration accepted his position. What about security in the Jordan Valley? What does it mean that Israel has a right to defend itself by itself? We will not agree to the entry of Israeli troops into the Palestinian territory. And as for the ongoing presence of the Israeli army in the Jordan Valley, it's ridiculous. Who will determine that ability? Who will say, that's it, the Palestinians are ready to assume responsibility for the valley? For its part, Israel would likely have significant objections to the Kerry framework terms if they are drafted according to Palestinian demands. Israel has indicated that the relatively minor alterations to the pre-1967 borders envisioned by the Palestinians are inadequate, and that there will have to be larger land swaps to accommodate most of the settlers. Netanyahu further wants any Jews whose settlements are on the Palestinian side of an agreed border to be given the option of staying on under Palestinian rule, which is a stance rejected by Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. Israel is adamantly opposed to any return for any Palestinian refugees to today's Israel. Netanyahu has reportedly insisted that there be no suggestion of legitimate Palestinian claims to Jerusalem in the framework document, and he has insisted that the Israeli army secure the West Bank-Jordan border even after Palestinian statehood. A senior Palestinian administrator said, "We said no to Kerry in the past, and we will say it again in the future." Asked how events would play out if the Palestinians reject the framework proposal when Kerry presents it, the official said, "All options are open to us, whether contacting international institutions to seek to advance Palestinian statehood unilaterally or in other ways." But he warned, "I have no doubt that the situation on the ground will get worse. For both sides, the stability we have grown used to will start to crack." The Palestinians are also having trouble digesting the Israeli insistence on the Palestinian recognition of Israel as a Jewish state, he noted. "We have no intention of dragging this conflict in a religious direction. Every sensible person in the Middle East is trying to keep religion away from the various conflicts, except for you. What's in it for you? The conflict between us is not religious. So why do you need our recognition that your state is Jewish? In your identification cards, your nationality is listed as Israeli and not as Jewish. You never asked such a thing of Egypt or Jordan. what is your concern? We are telling you outright, the peace agreement will bring about the end of the conflict and the end of all claims. So what is all this nonsense you are saying that this proves we won't accept the state of Israel? The whole world recognizes you. These are not the days of the founding of the state of Israel when the world didn't accept you, but you're stuck in that mindset. Israel Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman wants to sign a peace deal with the Palestinians, but not at the price of Israel's security. There are those who say don't give up any land. There are those who say a deal with the Palestinians at any price. I say yes to a deal with the Palestinians, but not at any price, Lieberman said. We've already had a deal with more holes in it than Swiss cheese, the foreign minister added, which was a likely reference to the 1993 Oslo Accords, which failed to produce a peaceful end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the August 2005 removal of Jews from the Gaza Strip. Lieberman's comments came after praising U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry as a friend of Israel, which drew criticism from the Jewish Home political party leader Naftali Bennett, who wrote on his Facebook page that our children's future is more important than our friends' compliments. European Union Ambassador to Israel Lars Farborg Anderson said that Israeli-European ties depend on the outcome of peace talks. Israel is an important partner of the European Union, and the Middle East peace process is one of the European Union's foreign policy priorities, and therefore a visit to Israel is almost a must for every European Parliament president, Farborg Anderson said. He said that the European Union is very keen to strengthen ties with Israel and bring them to the same level as European Union countries like Norway or Switzerland, but that because of the vital importance that the international community attaches to negotiations with the Palestinians, this depends to a large degree on the success of that process. Chief Palestinian negotiator Saeb Erekat reiterated the Palestinians' refusal to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. Erekat said that Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has made it clear to the United States that the Palestinians will not recognize Israel as a Jewish state. In addition, Abbas will not agree to any Israeli civilians or military officials remaining in a future Palestinian state. Furthermore, Erekat said that the Palestinians demand that Israel compensates the so-called Palestinian refugees whether they decide to stay in their own country, move to the Palestinian state, or return to Israel. Finally, Erekat said that the direct negotiations between them and Israel have stalled and would not be extended beyond April. He described the current state of the talks as being negotiations between U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and his team, and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas and his team, and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his team. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas said that his red lines in any framework peace agreement with Israel include East Jerusalem as the Palestinian capital and an Israeli withdrawal from all Palestinian territories within 4 years. He said that the Palestinians would categorically not recognize Israel as the Jewish state on the grounds that the Palestinians had recognized Israel in a 1993 mutual step. The Palestinians have made their red lines known to U.S. President Barack Obama, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, and the quartet of Middle East peace negotiators, which includes the United States, the European Union, Russia, and the United Nations. The Palestinian principles for a framework agreement is based upon the following terms. Number 1, an end to the conflict be based on the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative and relevant UN resolutions. Number 2, the borders of a Palestinian state be based upon the 1967 lines. Number 3, Israel must gradually withdraw from all Palestinian territory within 3 or 4 years. Number 4, East Jerusalem must be the capital of a Palestinian state. Number 5, there must be a resolution to the Palestinian refugee issue based upon international legitimacy, the Arab Peace Plan, and UN Resolution 194. Number 6, all Palestinian prisoners must be freed by Israel with its final withdrawal from Palestinian territory. These are the red lines of the Palestinian position, since without these principles there could be no just and comprehensive peace in the region, Abu Radena said. Well, that's going to conclude this week's update, where we shared with you regarding the current status of the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks. Until we do it again, Shalom in Yeshua the Messiah. Amen.